My name is Joan Branham. I'm the acting director of the Women's Studies and Religion program this year at Harvard Divinity School, and I am here substituting for Ann Browdy, who is on sabbatical. I am pleased to welcome all of you to the WSRP series of Works in Progress by the Research Associates. 5 research associates come each year to pursue a particular line of study, a topic, and also teach a course on that. I'd also like to just thank the Center for the Study of World Religions for having co-sponsored this event today. I'm happy to introduce to you Dr. Ronit Irshai. Ronit comes to us this year from Israel, where she is a faculty member of the Gender Studies program at Bar-Ilan University. She specializes in modern and contemporary Jewish philosophy and philosophy of Jewish law, with a particular emphasis in teaching and research on fertility issues, feminist criticism, Judaism, and bioethics. Ronit received her PhD in philosophy from Bar-Ilan University in 2006, and I'd like to also just welcome today her dissertation advisor, who is here from Bar-Ilan, Tamar Ross. So welcome. Let's see the fruits of your leadership. Ronit's dissertation, entitled Fertility, Gender, and Halakhah, A Feminist Perspective on Modern Responsa Literature, received a number of awards for outstanding research in Jewish law and philosophy of Halakhah. Her book will be published in Hebrew by Magnus Press of Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I just got news that it will also be published in English by a U.S. press, and I can't quite reveal the name yet because the contract isn't signed, but we will look forward to her forthcoming book in English under the title The Maleness of Jewish Law. Today, Ronit has entitled her talk Toward Building a Gender-Critical Approach to the Philosophy of Halakhah. Please welcome Ronit Irshai.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to see all of you here. I want to thank first of all, to Women's Studies in Religion program, to Joan, our amazing acting director, as well as my colleagues, for what has been so far a very exciting and very challenging year. I want to thank for the intellectual environment, our lovely colloquium, but especially for the friendship. In particular, I want to thank Liz. Liz, where are you? Our amazing coordinator. As you probably know, being a foreigner is not always that easy. But Liz helped me so much and makes it feel really like at home, far away from home. So thank you very much. And thank you for coming today to hear my lecture. Clifford Geertz once wrote that a scholar can hardly be better employed than in destroying a fear. He spoke about cultural relativism, while the fear I want to go after is vicious feminism. Within most modern Orthodox circles, and effectively all ultra-Orthodox circles, feminism is perceived as a dangerous threat because of its seemingly radical challenge to sacred values such as the Jewish family and the binding, largely immutable nature of Halakhah, that is Jewish law broadly construed. It is seen as well as a step onto the slippery slope toward reform and ultimately the loss of Jewish identity. Over the last 35 years, feminist religious scholars have done much to clarify the nature of their religiosity and its relation to their feminism. As a general rule, we can say that most of the comprehensive analyses undertaken by Jewish feminist scholars were not invested enough in halakhic question, that is, in the problem of applying feminist egalitarian framework within a halakhic world based largely on particular notions, or on patriarchal notions. Professor Rachel Adler, in a candid moment, made the following statement in her book, Engendering Judaism. Whether gender justice is possible within Halakhah and whether a feminist Judaism requires a Halakhah at all are foundational questions for feminist Jewish theology that have no parallel in Christian feminist theology. Appropriating the terms and the method of Halakhah itself, many feminists concluded drew them into a game they could not win. Halakhah became the feminists' elephant in the living room. Everybody agreed it was in the way, and no one knew how to get rid of it. This point of view is quite understood from a non-orthodox perspective. But even scholars writing from an expressly orthodox perspective have tended to give short shrift to the question of how feminist thinking can possibly be brought to bear within an orthodox framework that bases itself by definition on the Halakhah and maintains by reasons of its inherent conservatism an ethos that is extremely cautious about far-reaching changes that have not been shown to have a firm halachic basis. Professor Tova Hartman, for example, after a thorough analysis of how to formulate the problematic place of feminism within modern orthodoxy, writes as follows. In this way, the challenge of feminism to modern orthodoxy is far deeper than the challenge to specific aspects of Halakhah, or even to halachic process as a whole. What I propose then is not a halachic debate. Although I agree that the heart of the problem is rooted not in the halakha itself, but in the value system that underlies it, nevertheless, I'm convinced that the Jewish feminist project, especially in its modern Orthodox connection, will remain incomplete unless it proposes, at least in outline form, a way in which feminism can be applied within halachic discourse. It is important because even if we grant that the argument is not over whether halakha is capable of changing in a manner consistent with feminist views, the fact remains that at the end of the day, all the theological, ethical, and value-based questions make their way into halachic discourse and are formulated in halachic terms. That is the essential nature of orthodoxy, and one must necessarily speak in orthodoxy's essential language. The question I want to consider then is how to set up an intellectual framework for dealing with the problem of women within Orthodox halakha. This is a trick question, of course, insofar it assumes the existence of some objectively defined and differentiated Orthodox essence, including criteria for determining what is Orthodox and what is not. But do such inherent criteria of orthodoxy, be they substantive or procedural, really exist? Can we look to them to shed light on whether a particular halachic idea can be considered orthodox? At this stage, I'm inclined to think that that if there are, in fact, defining characteristics of orthodox halakha, they are grounded more in debate over content and less in the procedural rule of the game. Moreover, in my view, resort to the rules of the game usually clocks opposition to matters of content. Accordingly, it is possible that any suggested intellectual halachic framework that incorporates feminist insights will immediately be seen as non-orthodox, even in face of weighty and persuasive arguments to the contrary. It may be best, therefore, to reformulate the question. We should inquire not only about orthodox halachic rules or principles that might incorporate feminist insights, but also about the conditions under which a feminist halachic intellectual framework could be acceptable within the modern Orthodox community. The widespread assumption among scholars of Jewish feminism today is that the question of power provides the key of understanding the issue. They believe in principle that halakha could incorporate egalitarian insights if women were able somehow to attain power more approximating the power held by those who dominate important religious positions. In that event, their interpretations of sources would be accepted as legitimate as well. In the early 80s, Cynthia Ozick and Judith Plaskow argued about whether the problem of patriarchy within Judaism should be analyzed as a sociological or theological question. That is, is patriarchy merely optional excess baggage that was imposed on Judaism by external sources, something in no way intrinsic to Judaism, or is it something more profound, warranting even a critique of monotheism and its associated worldview? More recently, however, Susanna Heschel wrote, "Jewish feminism is not about equality with men. Feminism is about women's refusal to submit to male authority. The real issue is not equality, but power. Who's in charge? Who defines Judaism, and who determines whether or not we get to dance with the Torah?" seeing the question as entirely one of power is a position consistent with that of the critical legal studies movement, or in short CLS, that emerged in the United States during the 70s. The central claim of the CLS is that the interpretive dimension of adjudication is a fraud and a pretense. Given that the text can allow for all possible meanings, the number of interpretive options is so great that the choice among them is arbitrary, and the judge making that choice will necessarily give voice to his own values. Every law, accordingly, is simply a mask for power, for the interpretive dimension is in effect a veil placed over the exercise of political will and force. If that view is accurate and can be confirmed by analysis of a significant number of contemporary halachic responsa, then the question is not whether there exist legitimate alternative interpretations of the halachic sources. It is entirely a matter of who holds the key, the power to determining the official binding narrative. I must admit that until quite recently I shared Heschel's view, and even now I do not regard it as fundamentally off base. But I am not certain that that point of view provides a complete and genuine picture of the halachic reality as I understand it. If we examine halachic responsa throughout the ages in depth, I doubt we will reach a sweeping conclusion that all or even most of them express only the decisor's subjective worldview and values cloaked in the trappings of legitimate halachic exegesis. At times, to be sure, such an assessment will be accurate, but it is far from universally the case. I think it would be more accurate to embrace a weaker claim according to which a decisor may interject, most probably unconsciously, his own values, yet truly and sincerely believe that he has reached the true position of the Halakhah and the demand of the Torah to do the right and the good. Beyond that, the concept of power, as portrayed in the CLS model, which is quite Marxist, strikes me as too simplistic. As Michel Foucault has importantly taught us, we must come to a different understanding of the concept of power. It does not operate solely on a vertical axis from above to below. Rather, it is more diffuse, deployed within a network of relationships among entities and from below to above as well. It should not be thought of solely as something oppressive. It has a creative role in producing knowledge and discourse, and does not necessarily instill false consciousness. It can sometimes be engaged in truth. That given, it becomes necessary once again to reformulate the question, because Foucault's model suggests that we already possess power. The question is no longer merely one of how to attain power in order to fight the religious establishment in support of a more egalitarian interpretation of halachic texts. Instead, we must work to understand whether there exist barriers that constrain the decisor, and just what the ethos of objective decision-making or adjudication actually means. In addition, we must ask how to use wisely the power of the community in order to take a more significant and weighty part in the legal halachic game in which we are participants. That calls in turn for a complex understanding of the relationships among text, judge, and the social community. I want to briefly discuss the ethos of legal objectivity that has been so derided in CLS and feminist jurisprudence in juxtaposition with the concept of halachic objectivity that has been so derided in religious feminist circles, yet is so important and meaningful as part of the Orthodox ethos. A recent article by a young rabbi writing in the Israeli popular press, for example, bore the title, "And who will issue halachic rulings for redheads?" He meant, of course, to show the supposed absurdity of the view that rabbis cannot overcome their personal biases, particularly with respect to gender. What we need then is a new understanding of legal objectivity in order to preserve the ethos a new understanding of legal objectivity in order to preserve the ethos of objectivity while still recognizing the part played by subjective inclinations. I think we can cast some light on the matter by considering in the context of the debate between two well-known American legal scholars, Owen Fisk and Stanley Fish. Going along partially with the CLS school, OMFIS rejects the formalism that strives to neutralize the subjective dimension of adjudication, or even declines entirely to recognize it. He understands that adjudication is an interpretive process involving dynamic interaction between reader and text, an interaction that reflects both the objective and the subjective dimensions of human experience. But he posits a substantial difference between a subjective dimension and the undesirable nihilism that he sees as spreading through the world of legal theory. Objectivity, according to Fis, objectivity in law, means that an interpretation can be measured against a set of external norms that transcends the person offering the interpretation. And that in turn means that it is bounded, that it is subject to restraints. Objectivity means as well that an interpretation can be judged by something other than the interpreter's personal proclivities and his ideas regarding what is legally correct. Objectivity transmits a message of detachment. Fist thinks that the interpreter does not enjoy absolute unlimited freedom. He is not free to read into the text any meaning that he wishes, for he is governed by an array of rules that specifically define the relevance and weight to be assigned to every factor. These rules and principles are not simply the whim of individual judges. Rather, they shape the profession of law, constituting its professional grammar. Of course, they are binding only if the legal community invests them with binding authority. Stanley Fish is a leading opponent to Fish's position. He reasons that if the rules are to constrain the judge's discretion and constitute the objective dimension of adjudication, they themselves must be read independently, in a manner not contingent on any interpreter. They must convey their meaning directly to every reader without regard to the reader's own perspective. To state it differently, if the rules tell us what to do with the text, they cannot be a text themselves. Rather, they must be documents in the strong sense in which the term is used in old-style historiography. The problem, of course, is that the rules are in fact a text, and they themselves require interpretation. Accordingly, they cannot serve as the barrier that constrains the interpreter. In Fish's view, then, rules always presume a pre-existing understanding of the questions that they are likely to raise. One not equipped with these presuppositions will immediately inquire about the meaning and implication of the rule, and the answer will pertain to one or another set of practices that will alert him to the reality of a particular area of the law. In other words, Fish believes that the rules pre-exist practice, but Fish maintains that clarity will be attained through a sort of knowledge or practice that shapes the rules more than it flows from them. Similarly, law students study cases and infer rules from them. When they later come around to learning rules, they will know how to apply them only because they are already deeply immersed in practice and have become part of the context within which the rules acquire their meaning. In light of all that, Fish considers Fish's fear of unrestrained interpretation to be groundless and sees no need for the interpreter or judge to be bound by external constraints, the law's rules. To be deeply within the context, as the interpreter or judge must be, means to be constantly aware of and to function within an array of norms, standards, and routines that both define and are defined by context. In this way, categories that are internalized through the course of training become part of a mode of thinking. Because one is always situated in this sense, one is already bounded, and one therefore need not seek out external barriers. In other words, it is the interpretive community which assigns that situated sense and creates its practices and norms that determine the force of an interpretation. At first glance, it seems that Fish's concept of judicial objectivity suits at least the declared ethos of actual halachic practice, and that the interpretive community as a whole, decisors and faithful alike, want to preserve this ethos fully. Still, I do not believe that an examination of halachic reality can come up with an objective criterion in the sense FIS means to present it. The rules of interpretation and decision making are far from absolute and are themselves subject to ongoing interpretation, and that's why Fish's position seems better suited to illuminating the halachic phenomenon. Objectivity, as he envisions it, is understood to be within legal practice, in the sense that the constraint on discretion flows from the interpreter's own situated knowledge. That situated knowledge is not his exclusive domain. Rather, the practices and modes of thought that he shares with the legal community are what allow for the acceptance and legitimation of his interpretive decisions. The question we should ask now is, how can any change take place within the legal system? The law, Fish would say, even in its seemingly technical utterances, always reflects some religious, moral, or social vision, and when a decision is objected to on the basis of religious or moral principles, the objection is not external to the law. Rather, it represents an effort to change the law so as to alter the understanding of what is internal to it. To effectuate a change, then, one must be both internal to the legal community, but also open to new ideas from the wider society. This is the very situation of those modern Orthodox women, who, though part of the halachic community, also partake of modern feminist consciousness. They are firmly planted within the religious world, and with the recent growth of Torah study by women in the world of Halakhah's internal grammar as well, and therefore are deeply invested with the practices, norms, and situated knowledge that are the key to acceptance of halachic interpretation as legitimate. Equipped with the new understanding of halachic objectivity, we can now better understand what should be a gender-critical approach to the philosophy of halacha. In my view, one of the main tasks of Orthodox women who do care about feminist values is creating alternative halachic stories. By that, I do not mean the proposing of local halachic solutions to one or another problem that women face. I'm not seeking the halachic tools that can be used to effectuate desired change in a specific halachic matter, though I, of course, do not deny the importance of such local solution. An alternative halachic story is much wider and composed of two elements. First, we must create a halachic genealogy with the goal of uncovering the hidden values or moral paradigms on which halachic rulings related to women rely, and the exegetical tactics and rhetoric that have been used to generate the hegemonic story. Second, when halachic rules fail to produce gender justice for women, we have to propose a preference for halachic principles to overcome them. Let me explain and demonstrate those elements one by one. A new halachic story is bound up, as I've noticed, in discovering the halachic genealogy and the hidden paradigms that have shaped the halacha's hegemonic attitudes. As such, this mission is entwined with the transition from a perspective of necessity to one of contingency. A transition that I believe embodies one of the most important aims of postmodernism, as notably expressed by Foucault and Rorty. To achieve the transition from one perspective to another, Foucault made use of the genealogical method. Genealogy means, quite literally, the study of origins. As a method, it does not necessarily preclude regarding the subject being studied in a positive light, but is most often used critically. Scholars have noted that the genealogical method must sometimes be understood as the search for divergence, for the unnecessary connections between the links of the chain. Thus, the genealogies that Foucault proposes in Mendes and Civilization or in History of Sexuality are meant to liberate us either from the dichotomy between menace and reason or from a particular worldview regarding sex and sexuality. Similarly, halachic genealogy unfolds the legal background of the hegemonic halachic story and provides examples of how certain links in the chain have been forgotten, how the genealogical continuity presented by the hegemonic story is not necessarily the only one possible. It therefore has a liberating effect and therapeutic value as well, particularly from the illusion of necessity, as if this is the only way the final verdict can be shaped. To illustrate, let us consider contemporary halachic rulings concerning fertility issues. If we examine, by tracing the halachic genealogy, trends within those rulings, we find something quite interesting. In all matters related to abortion and contraception, the signal tendency is one of stringency, while in matters related to modern artificial fertility, the decisions tend to be extremely lenient. In other words, sex without procreation is treated strictly, procreation without sex is treated leniently, on the premise that reproduction at almost any cost is the preferred value. What can account for this pro-natalist tendency? Certainly there are multiple explanations, like the Holocaust, for example, but I do believe they must be supplemented by an understanding of the gender-related issues that underlie the ideology reflected in the decisions. In my judgment, a latent concept of gender that defines women and femininity with reference to women's biological functions constitutes a necessary condition for this trend. This concept does not regard the value of woman as an end in itself in the Kantian sense. Rather, it sees her primarily in a reproductive role as a means. And if this suggestion seems too subversive, listen carefully to the words of Rabbi Yehuda Henkin, who does not necessarily reject all aspects of religious feminism, as we realized just today in my class. In a 1978 responsum, he wrote as follows on the question of spacing pregnancies, here translated from his Hebrew. If a question is presented to me, I clarify whether the woman wishes to use contraception for the child's sake or in order to go out to work. Here there is a difference between countries. Whereas in the United States, toddlers stay at home until the age of 5 and only then go to nursery school, here in the Holy Land, babies are placed in creches at age 3 or less, enabling women to go out to work. In such a case, therefore, there is no room for dispensation. This conclusion implies that the woman, as an independent subject with her own needs and interests, is not taken into account in the ruling, unless, of course, her health is in danger, which is not the case here. Indeed, when the question is presented from the woman's viewpoint, it usually elicits a more stringent ruling. Uncovering the moral paradigm underlying the exclusion of women from religious ritual is even more outrageous. The primary basis for that exclusion is the image of woman as a ticking sexual time bomb. The idea of holiness, I mean it. The idea of holiness is profoundly tied to it. The more a woman is hidden, the holier the atmosphere. In other words, women is equated with the unholy or even the anti-holy. At the same time, many seen as a sex-obsessed hormone-dump. Halachic genealogy can uncover this paradigm, present it to modern Orthodox men and women, and ask whether they are prepared to look into the mirror and then buy into this image. Uncovering the problematic moral consciousness on which many halachic rules rely will likely force the modern Orthodox community to confront the question of why it continues to cooperate with that consciousness, even though it has managed in certain areas to find halachic solutions that enable it to overcome similarly problematic situations. For example, the halachic principle of acting in the interests of peace overcomes the arguably racist halachic rule, a rule not applied, thank God, that forbids violating the Shabbat in order to care for a sick Gentile. A sick Jew may be cared for. In other words, modern Orthodox society will have to account in a meaningful way for its inconsistencies. Why, when it is the dignity of women that is at stake, does it fail to apply halachic principles that would allow for reasonable solutions? I'm not so naive to think that such a process will encounter no resistance, given the clear and obvious danger that it might bring about radical changes in the structure of religious life. Indeed, we can already identify a typical sort of response, a tactic used effectively against efforts such as those I'm proposing. And it seems to me that part of the critical project of the alternative halachic story is to expose that tactic and publicly show it for what it is. I call this form of response formalistic reductionism, by which I mean that whenever one identified an effort to uncover the morally problematic value system implicit in halachic rulings, with respect to women, of course, the conservative counterattack goes something like this. You misunderstand entirely. It's entirely a formalistic matter, and the questions of values, if one is concerned about them, are situated totally elsewhere. That is what happened, for example, with respect to women's prayer groups. I don't want to go over all the argument with respect to this issue, which was already been treated extensively in Jewish feminist research, but not only that the most prominent that the most prominent of the various halachic issues involved here is that of the minyan, or prayer quorum. The halachic definition of a minyan is 10 males over the age of 13. The presence of such a group is prerequisite to public worship. When women are not counted in the group, prayer within a minyan is regarded more highly, for there are certain passages that may be recited only in this framework, and the divine presence comes to dwell only in an assembly of at least 10 men. Women's prayer group is in no way challenged the idea that women could not be part of a minyan. They made no request to be counted among the men at prayer, God forbid. They sought only to worship separately, to read from the Torah themselves, and to create at least the atmosphere of worship in a minyan similar to that of men. On surface, there should have been no halachic opposition to their doing so, but that, of course, wasn't the case. The most interesting element in the counterattack was the formalistic reduction. Minyan was suddenly transformed into something seemingly less important, a merely legal category having no bearing whatsoever on such matters as religious atmosphere or level of sanctity. The value component was shifted to individual prayer of the heart. Of course, it was not suggested that men abandon worship in a minyan and shift their focus from the formal minyan to heartfelt individual prayer. On second thought, there may be something more going on here, for a similar pattern is in an entirely different area, has been noted by sociologists of the workplace. Every profession entered by women has suffered an immediate reduction in status. Even the entry of women into the field of medicine was followed by emergence of medical fields valued more and less highly. What this suggests is that the weapon of formalistic reduction offers those who wield it not only theological benefits, allowing a return to the safe harbor of neutral objectivity without confronting disturbing moral issues and perhaps the need of change. It also offers the diminution of women's accomplishments in the area at issue. If women want to worship in the masculine style, that style becomes less valued, at least rhetorically, and is unchangeable only on purely formalistic grounds. It is clear as well that moving the focus of discussion to halachic formalism closes the door to analysis and ultimately divests the halakha of all moral significance. There are, to be sure, Jewish religious philosophies that value the neutralization of halakha's value component and regard the highest form of divine service to be adherence to halakha simply as divine dictate. That, for example, the religious philosopher Irshai. But I do not believe those views carry significant weight within modern orthodoxy. That being so, uncovering formalistic reductionism directs the community back to fundamental questions regarding the moral concepts that shape its religious world. Is the community prepared to accept this formalism as its overall religious philosophy? If not, and I assume that answer will be the one most often given, Why accept it only as part of the counterattack against feminism? An alternative halachic story will be interested as well as noted in the rhetoric and interpretive tactics that have been used in the formulation of the hegemonic halachic story. Rhetoric is of considerable importance, for it can sometimes reveal even more than the bottom line of the halachic responsum where the decisors' value lie. An interesting example is the halachic statement of opinion written by Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein to a commission appointed by the Israeli government in 1979 to look into questions of abortion and legislation related to it. And I checked it, he republished this halachic article in 2003, so he didn't change his mind. And rhetoric as well. For our purposes, his conclusion in the responsum is less important than the rhetoric he used in justifying his position, here translated from his Hebrew. It should be emphasized, especially to one seeking a humane approach, and likely on that account to be drawn to an exaggeratedly liberal position on this issue, that from the perspective of the fetus and one concerned for him, liberalism comes at the expense of humanness. It is not only the honor of our Heavenly Father that presses its demands, the aspect that requires caution with regard to what is forbidden and obedience to God's commands, whatever the cost, but it is filial honor as well, the human and moral aspect that insists on the dignity of human beings and concerns itself with their welfare, that rises up against a flood of abortions. This formulation resounds with Rabbi Lichtenstein's clear moral stance. From the perspective of the fetus and one who is concerned for him, the human and moral aspect that insists on the dignity of human beings and concerns itself with their welfare. Rabbi Lichtenstein chooses this wording to formulate the question solely from the perspective of the fetus. To view the woman as legitimate party in interest, having a position or a say with respect to pregnancy or abortion, is negatively branded as exaggeratedly liberal, while concern for the fetus and its interests is given the affirmative designation of humaneness. Moreover, the dignity of human beings in this context refers to that of the fetus, but not that of the woman. The more we critically parse halachic narratives on various subjects, the more we uncover both the rhetoric and the interpretive tactics used by decisors in grounding their positions, and the more we identify instances of rhetoric harmful to women, especially when they're used by contemporary rabbis, and uncover their interpretive tactics and their manner of construing the sources, the more we see that there is no moral necessity to the existing halachic story. At the same time, opening up the halacha's genealogy can indicate the path to be taken in constructing an alternative halachic story. An important question, though, is whether it will always be possible to do so. And here we come to the second part of the process, which is a preference for halachic principles rather than halachic rules. To this point, we've been engaged in parsing the dominant halachic narrative into its factors and uncovering the various ways in which it is problematic. But how can we create a different story? The exegetical tools at our disposal are many and varied, and in many cases can be useful in forging a different halakha. On occasion, however, the halachic rules will not be able to withstand the feminist critique. Creating a new halachic story, therefore, will likely acquire at times the favoring of halachic principles over halachic rules. An interesting suggestion in this regard has recently been made by Rabbi Professor Daniel Sperber, writing about the rule of congregational dignity and the principle of human dignity. The rule of congregational dignity serves as the halachic reason for barring women from reading Torah in the synagogue before a congregation of men. The classic Talmudic text on the subject appears at Tractate Megillah 23a. Our rabbis taught, all may be numbered among the 7 who are called to the Torah on Shabbat, even a minor and even a woman. But the sages said, a woman is not to read from the Torah on account of congregational dignity. Understood simply and straightforwardly, this statement means that a woman reading from the Torah would humiliate the congregation of men, because it would imply that no one man present was capable of reading from the Torah. Other passages in the Talmud in which the term congregational dignity is used confirm that it refers to a sort of humiliation that the congregation, the men, might sense. To overcome it, Sperber proposes to apply the principle of human dignity, which, like other principles in the legal corpus, can often trump local rules. The principle of human dignity appears in the Babylonian Talmud as well as in the Talmud of the land of Israel, and rabbis understood it as something that can overcome rules likely to impair a person's dignity. In their words, great is human dignity which displays every negative commandment in the Torah. What strategy has been applied against this proposal? First, we again see formalistic reductionism. It has been argued repeatedly in quite few articles that the concept of congregational dignity and human dignity are something entirely different from what we think they are. They are, it is claimed, formal and objective and therefore not subject to change. For example, Professor Shochetman, an Orthodox legal scholar and expert in Jewish law, maintains that congregational dignity is not a general or subjective concept. In his view, it is objective and must be understood only in the context of religious duties that are binding on men but not on women. Nor, in his view, is human dignity a subjective concept, but can be invoked by a person sensing an affront in a particular situation. Rather, translated from his Hebrew, human dignity is a term used only with respect to something that is shameful to every person by virtue of being a person, such as going naked, and not with respect to something that only one or more individuals see as shameful to themselves. If we apply that to the majority issue, we are speaking of a very specific group of women who argue that they suffer distress and as a result of being denied the possibility of being called to the Torah as men are. If we are speaking of something that is not regarded as an affront to women in general, we cannot apply the principle of great is human dignity, for the entire community of women is not affronted by it. Given this formalistic understanding of human dignity, I truly wonder whether it can ever be applied as a binding moral principle within the halachic infrastructure. A second prong of the counter-strategy is to note that even though the principle of human dignity is firmly anchored in Jewish tradition, it has been used by decisors over the ages only rarely in extraordinary cases. Accordingly, it has been argued that while Sperber's position is grounded in the halachic literature, as a practical matter, halachic decision-making does not favor the sort of reasoning he has proposed. This is the sort of pre-existing sense that Fish speaks of, and an informal understanding of what is done and what isn't done in the practice of a particular field of law. I have to say that this sort of argument is quite depressing. It does not deny the legitimacy of the proposal, but argues only that we don't do things that way. An argument I take to mean that the problem is not perceived as serious enough to warrant deploying the heavy weaponry of favoring a principle over a rule. Still, I believe the important role of religious feminism includes restoring sanity, a restoring of the balance between what matters more and what matters less, and avoiding the transformation of legalism into a sort of idolatry. And so, whenever the foregoing argument is trotted out, there is a need for someone to proclaim loudly that the emperor, in fact, has no clothes. I suggested at the outset that based on the models advanced by Foucault and Fish, the halachic community functions as a player in the game and already has the power to influence the shaping of the hegemonic halachic narrative. But that is not the full picture. For one who is empowered must know as well how to implement that power wisely. Only in that way will it be possible to achieve any sort of consensus. Here, I believe, we can usefully resort to insights from the field of rhetoric, especially as developed in the writings of the legal scholar and philosopher Chaim Perlman. In his studies, Perlman teaches us that when an issue involves conflicting values and cannot be resolved by reference to objective standards, it can be helpful to appeal to rhetorical mechanisms, since rhetoric makes it possible for certain opinions to prevail over other competing opinions. I cannot deal here with all Perlman's perceptions, but I want to look briefly at one of his insights that strike me as critically important for the matter at hand. Perlman determines that when a speaker sets out to persuade an audience, the first, most basic, and perhaps most important thing for him or her to confirm is that the audience accepts the premises of the speech, which I hope is going on here. Without that acceptance, the presentation will be doomed to failure. If agreement exists on basic premises, it may be transferable to conclusions as well. But if there is no agreement as to premises, or if any such agreement is very tenuous, the speaker will have to use every possible means to bolster it, or may be well advised simply not to speak. Borrowing from Perlman's analysis, I believe that the success of the Orthodox feminist project depends in great measure on attaining the basic agreement on fundamental principles on moral values. And here I come to full circle, returning to the alternative halachic story I proposed earlier. The whole point of that story was to present moral values regarding which the modern Orthodox community is indeed in disagreement. By presenting that paradigm, it can force many modern Orthodox Jews to confront the basis premises that they are unwittingly buying into, and which, as a practical matter, they likely reject in most areas of their lives. If we can show that there is no divide in the values, and that the distinction between how they are applied in our religious and our secular dimensions of life is an artificial one, our task will be made easier, for we will widen the circle of people within the halachic community who will express their dissatisfaction with the status quo, or will at least be troubled by it. Moreover, following Perlman again, I believe the Gender Project must be aware as well of the religious establishment's sensitivities and proceed with recognition that their concerns are valid. A wise use of power must always take account of the other side's sincerely felt pain. Hence, the importance of formulating a model that does not entirely overturn the idea of generating objective halakhah, a halakhah that is not given over solely to the caprice of the decisor, but that is influenced by the inner grammar that the community takes a significant part in shaping. Let me sum up then. I have suggested in this lecture that we do not accept the radical CLS model in its entirety, and therefore not take the view that the halachic corpus is nothing more than the subjective whim of the decisor. That rhetoric, all too common in religious feminist discourse, is imprecise as well as counterproductive to the formation of any consensus. Instead, the model advanced by Stanley Fish suggests an understanding of objectivity and legal creativity that we might well adopt. Consistent with that, I have suggested that the forging of an alternative halachic story comprising several significant components, creating a genealogy of hegemony halachic tendencies with the goal of uncovering the hidden moral paradigms on which halachic rulings related to women rely, uncovering the problematic nature of the counter-strategy that makes use of what I have termed formalistic reductionism, assessing the rhetoric of halachic rulings and insistence that where halachic rules fail to produce gender justice, one must look for support to halachic principles, even if doing so is not common, although legitimate. By doing so, we can shed light on the fact that the Orthodox community, or the modern Orthodox community, does share, for the most part, the same values, but lapses into inconsistency when denying the relevance of these values to women. We also might bolster the agreement on premises, as suggested by Perlman, and increase our chances in this stubborn game. Thank you very much.
is open to some questions. So I'm going to actually let you sort of field it and take some questions.
Maria, please.
You said that when women enter something or a field that it decreases its value. Would you say that this concept applies to Torah study?
Ooh.
Since there's an increase of women, Jewish women studying Torah.
This is a very, very good question. I have to think about it, but well, there is something going on. I think that the new wisdom of women is not really valued by Halakhah disciples. I want to demonstrate. In Ishmat, that you already know, there is a special program for women as Halachic advisors. But when those women really want the Halachic approval, they tend to call to the rabbi and to ask him. When there is a real difficult issue that they have to deal with. But I'm not sure if that is going on. I mean, if that is going to proceed in that way. Perhaps the more the phenomena is going to be common and widespread, perhaps that won't be the situation. Yes. But it's a good question.
I'd like to add to her that what really is happening is as women enter the field, then those men who feel uncomfortable with it introduce new distinctions in the type of learning.
Yes.
That is, they'll say that women are learning for practical purposes, that men are learning only for purely theoretical purposes, or in the areas in which women develop, those become more devalued, and those that are remaining to men become the most prestigious.
But there's also something else going on here. For example, Rabbi Shagar just died a few months ago, I think, and really didn't deny at all the feminist revolution and the women's Torah study. He really wanted to hear a new voice in Torah study in general, and he wants women to revival the Torah study in general. I mean, he doesn't want it to keep continuing in the male style. He really wants it to be something new, something that really, as I've said, do something really to effectuate and to revive this sort of learning, because he sees the problems with formalistic understanding of Torah study. But he is, as far as I know, is the only one.
I just wonder about this as a premise. If it isn't precisely more complex, we're talking about now the possibility, although fading possibility, it looks like, of a woman president. Now, is that going to decrease the value of U.S. presidency? And it seems to me that kind of example raises the question of what happens to real power. And is it the case that, for example, if women are behaving as though they were a minion, then that power is redefined and shifted elsewhere. But are there formal cases where the power is held? Do you see what I mean? So the question is whether that power can be shifted elsewhere, or whether in fact women inhabiting it.
Yes. Perhaps this diminution of women accomplishment is going on only on the first generation, perhaps, or in the first stage. But later on, so long the phenomena is going to be more common and widespread, so something else will go on here. I'm quite sure about. I can see it right now happening. Yes.
A little bit building on that question, I'm fascinated by your addressing the notion of a concept and a rule, and the thing about the principle, and the thing about the respect for the congregation. So, and it was interesting when you said that moment. You said, "Why doesn't a woman get called to the Torah and doesn't read?" Well, it's on the notion of respect for the congregation, or dignity of the congregation, meaning that if she did, it meant there was no man available. I was wondering if, one, that was your interpretation, or is that the response literature, or is it something about what Karen said and what you've talked about, the devaluation? If a woman is reading the Torah, well, anybody can read the Torah then, and the power has been diffused and lessened. So that's the first part of my question, and then the second part is just at the same point you said that Daniel Sperber then proposed to go on this other principle of dignity of the human being, or man or woman. But that sounds like a huge ray of hope. But then in that part of your talk, you said that you thought that was not going to be, or not working, and some people have argued against it on a series of other, rules or something. And I'm just wondering, it just seems to me that has so much potential. Is there no way of bringing that to the people who are much more inclined to finding a way of going for the dignity of the human being versus these other rules? So it's just more practical.
As to the first part of the question, to my judgment, when I see this subject of congregational dignity or human dignity in the Talmud, I must admit that my simple interpretation of this is that this is humiliating for the men, for the congregation of men. But according to Halakhah decisors or interpreters, this is not the situation. I mean, they don't want to, nowadays they don't want to interpret it like this because, of course, there is a moral problem to interpret it that way, and that's why they are escaping to formalistic reductionism, as I was trying to say. As to your second part of the question, just remind me. The hope to use the human dignity principle. Well, it is complex. I mean, I think things depends on basically on the grassroots level. The more women would insist on that, the more women goes to these women prayer groups or other minions that are really enable women within the Orthodoxy to pray in a more equal way. I mean, it's not totally equal. Perhaps it won't be equal in Orthodoxy, but in a more equal way. The more they're doing so, the more the deciders will see that it really precious. I mean, they're really concerned about it. So the more from below the community would act in a different way, I think there would be a reaction in the halachic ruling as well. But just now, that's not the situation, not at all. I mean, perhaps only one community in Israel who is praying in a more egalitarian way within Orthodoxy. But the interesting thing is not this community, but the counterattack. I mean, I'm interested in the counterattack to understand why it is so problematic. What about the fear? What is the fear here? As I've said at the beginning. Please.
I don't have a question, but just sort of want to perhaps suggest something that may be fruitful to engage with. And to preface it, I'm sure you know that within an Islamic Sharia and the laws there, a lot of the procedures, and also in terms of the interpretation and rules of interpretations, a lot of people have argued, historians, that much of this came in the first few decades or centuries, in part at least through conversion of Yemenite rabbis into Islam. So there's a whole lot of methodology in Islamic legal interpretation which is almost identical, not quite, but it has been very much informed by it. And as I hear you and have followed what's been going on a little bit in the kind of work you're proposing, of course it immediately reminds me of what over the past 20 years has been done by a lot of Muslim feminists in trying to deal with what's the ethical issues behind particular rulings, how can we revise this that would respond to feminist sensibilities, etc. It made me just sitting here think that maybe something that happened in a much earlier moment in history through conversion and transformations of that kind. It is time to now do it in terms of actually building bridges between people who seem to be doing in terms of methods and philosophical renovations in the two traditions by actually consciously organizing ways in which people can compare methods and this kind of thing. And I wonder if any of this is happening.
Actually, I think I have Muslim students in Israel in the gender studies program, and they wrote some very interesting works, papers, about the strategies of feminist, of Islamic feminism in order to facilitate a change within the Islamic law. And from what I've read so far, which is not so much, but I'm quite aware to the fact that within the Islamic law, the strategies, at least they are quite similar, I must admit, to what's going on within Jewish Orthodoxy. So perhaps when I come back to Israel, and I do something with my Arabic, which is not so good, but I can improve it. It is a good idea. Yeah. Avitar, please.
First, thank you for a very, very fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I have really not really questions, two comments. One thing is about the last thing that also was raised about the dignity of the person.
Yes.
So again, this is from another community, but in the conservative world last year, the decision was the issue of ordaining openly gay and lesbians. So the decision that won finally used one of its major arguments was this exact argument, saying, yes, we have all these legal problems, but because of dignity of the person, of humans, then we have to allow them to be a full member. So that's not the Orthodox world, but it still gives an example of where it won in some battle. The other thing, comment you speak mostly about the rabbis, those that make the decision.
Yes.
And I think today it's true in many communities, especially the communities that you are really interested in, the gap between the people, the public, and those making decisions, the gap in knowledge is relatively small. There are many people that do know the halachic process more than in the past, certainly.
Yes. That's correct.
Still, it is. I think there is maybe one other concept that can be used, the one that used often by historian of Halakhah, sociologist Yaakov Katz,
yes.
The concept of ritual instinct. It's a bit like what you said, but from the perspective of the people, there are things that we don't do. So you spoke about most of all the big those make decisions, but in many cases in the Al-Hayat, what you have is that the concept of people, they do not know to justify something, to say this is correct or not, this is permissible or not.
That's the way we're doing.
They feel that something is wrong about it, or something is right about it. And this maybe, if in these communities slowly the ritual instinct of people change, and they say, yeah, for sure, women should be here, part of the group. Then that will be grassroots will influence the higher level.
As to your first comment about the ordaining of gays and lesbians. Truly, the project that I'm interested in is the philosophy of Halakhah, and perhaps the feminism is just a test case in order to understand. Although it's I'm invested in this case, but it's a meaningful test case in order to understand what is Halakhah at all. And the boundaries between Orthodox Halakhah and Conservative Halakhah. I don't want to say Reform Halakhah because there the notion of Halakhah is not so important, although there are very interesting philosophies of Halakhah that created there, and I'm dealing with it now. I'm not sure what's going to be in the future within Orthodox Halakhah, whether it's going to be developed toward the idea that gay and lesbians can be ordained. I really couldn't see it right now happening, but perhaps it will. And it is really a very important question. What are the mechanisms, and especially from a hermeneutical point of view, what's going on here within the halachic interpretation and mechanisms that enable a change which is legitimate later on. So So that's about the first comment. About the second comment, about the grassroots level and the ritual instinct of Yaakov Katz, I think that that's basically what's going on here nowadays. And as I've said before, so long people are going to do what they're doing, the change is going to come. I just want to demonstrate or to give a small example. I'm like a good Jewish woman, perhaps. I'm praying in 2 synagogues. One is more equal than the other because well, I have a family, and I have to compromise with all the interests of friends and everything. Not everything is about feminism. Unfortunately, maybe. So, in this other synagogue, that I'm going to, I can give always. I'm being asked to give lessons, but it always after davening, it always after the prayer, because during the worship, only men can give their lessons. So one time, I really spoke with my friends. They're a close friend of mine, and I really asked them, really, what's going on here? I'm good for later. I mean, after davening, and what's happening between the time of really when we are praying and later on 10 minutes after that? What's going on here? And then when we are discussing it, I've realized again and again and again that people, it would be. I mean, it seems to you even naive what I'm saying now, but people are not aware to the moral paradigm that is beneath those issues. Why women cannot, not to lead the prayer, but just to give a lesson. So people are not quite aware of what's really going on here. And when I'm exposing this moral paradigm, and I'm telling to a good friend of mine, listen, everything is about sex. What's going on here? So they have to rethink about it. And I think the more we are doing this work of revealing or uncovering the moral paradigm, the more we have the chance to reshape the consciousness of the modern Orthodox community. Please.
I'm wondering, as modern Orthodox women strive to gain their gain acceptance of their opinions and comments about Halakhah, do they invoke the few historical examples like Bruya, Rabbi Meir's wife from the Talmud, who was respected and consulted nearly 2,000 years ago? Are those few figures spoken about and
First of all, I'm not sure that Bruya was so valued. The story about her is really sad. What happened to her at the end. Well, of course, those images are in the game. Even the institutions, are being called after those names. Yalta, Bruya. But how many do we have? Yalta, Bruya. Bruya, Yalta. Glickle family. That's it, basically.
Thank you so much. Perfect example of the sort of groundbreaking work that the research associates are doing, and opening up the field in so many ways, in their own ways and shapes. Thank you so much. I also have the wine list here. I wasn't going to read it to you. There is, Sauvignon Blanc and that, but I have on here also the indication for our next lecture, which is exactly 1 month from today. It is May 1st. It is across the street at 5:15 in the Braun Room, and it'll be our last presentation of the year. And Miriam Segal, one of our research associates, will be presenting her research, and the title is Nation, Gender, and Scripture in Hebrew Poetry. So I want to invite you all to please join us a month from today. Thank you very much.